What would you do if you were $80 away from losing the home you'd shared with someone you loved for 26 years, and the only thing standing between you and the street was a decision that looked, from every rational angle, like a very expensive mistake? Audrey Carmichael was not the kind of woman who gambled. She was 62 years old, a former school librarian from Kenora, Ontario, and she had spent 4 decades making sensible decisions, the small, quiet, careful kind that keep a household running. She clipped hydro bills. She tracked grocery receipts down to the last dollar. She planned things. But that was before Paul. Paul Carmichael had been her husband for 31 years. He'd been a high school shop teacher with calloused hands, and a loud laugh, and an absolute conviction that things could always be fixed if you looked at them long enough. He had also been a type 1 diabetic who had not, despite everyone's encouragement, been particularly careful about it. By the time the complications became undeniable, they were serious. By the time they were serious, they were very expensive. Paul died on a Tuesday evening in February in the spare bedroom of their house on 3rd Street, which they had converted into a home care room with rented equipment and a visiting nurse and every accommodation Audrey could arrange. She had been holding his hand. He had looked at her with that expression she had always thought of as his particular face, the one that said he knew something she didn't quite believe yet. And he said, "The quiet ones always hold the deepest secrets, Audrey. Don't be afraid to look." She hadn't known what he meant. She had thought at the time that he was simply drifting. That was 8 months before the county tax deed auction. The total outstanding debt Audrey had inherited, Paul's final hospital invoices, the medical equipment rentals, the specialist fees that provincial coverage hadn't touched, and the remaining mortgage on the 3rd Street house, came to a figure that felt less like a number and more like a physical wall. The bank had sent its 3rd notice. Her checking account held $82. Her next survivor's benefit payment was 10 days away. The foreclosure date was in 3 weeks. On a cold Tuesday morning in October, a friend from the county clerk's office named Janet Brule told Audrey there might be a filing position opening up in the district courthouse in Kenora. Audrey drove downtown, found parking, and walked into the building. The position had been filled the previous afternoon. She was too cold and too tired to go back to the car, so she sat down in the last row of the public gallery of Courtroom 3, where a regional tax deed auction was already underway, and decided to stay warm for a little while. The auctioneer was a man named Bob Fenwick, broad-faced, reading glasses perched at the end of his nose, who was working through a list of seized properties with the enthusiasm of someone alphabetizing a filing cabinet. Barren lots north of Dryden, a collapsed barn near Vermilion Bay, 2 parcels of commercial land outside Minaki that drew brief competitive bidding before settling into silence. Then, Lot 47, commercial property, Highway 17, Kenora District. The Blackwater Cannery site, 2.8 acres plus existing structure. Opening bid set at $190 to cover administrative liens. A low, collective groan moved through the gallery. Audrey had heard of the Blackwater Cannery. Everyone in Kenora had. It was one of those local stories you absorbed without meaning to, mentioned in passing at dinner tables, brought up whenever the lakefront came up in conversation. The cannery had been built in 1968 by a businessman named Regis Harmon from Dryden, who had made money in the commercial fishing trade on Lake of the Woods and decided to vertically integrate. For 20 years it had employed people, processed walleye and pike, and shipped canned fish across the province. In October of 1991, 7 families across northwestern Ontario had been hospitalized with severe botulism poisoning. 2 elderly residents of Sioux Narrows, a woman named Helen Crow, 74, and a man named Albert Fiddler, 81, had died. The source was traced to Blackwater canned product. Regis Harmon insisted his company had followed all protocols. Provincial investigators found records indicating contamination in several production batches, but could not conclusively prove Harmon had known before shipping. The cannery was seized by creditors. Harmon avoided criminal charges. He moved south and was rarely spoken of again. He had died in Guelph in 2019, aged 87, in a private care facility. The cannery had sat empty on the Lake of the Woods shoreline for 33 years. Lead paint concerns and a provincial heritage flag from the Anishinaabe nation of the Lake of the Woods had complicated any sale or demolition. Bob Fenwick asked, already sounding resigned. "Copper pipe alone is worth the opening bid, folks. Come on." Audrey looked down at her handbag. Inside was her wallet. Inside her wallet was $196 in cash. Grocery money, gas money, the last physical currency she had until her benefit check arrived. She was not going to bid. She was cold and exhausted and grieving and about to lose her house. And then she thought about Paul's voice, and she thought about copper pipe. An old fish cannery would have copper plumbing throughout the processing areas. The scrappers who came through these places usually focused on accessible runs. A cannery that size, if they had missed anything, could hold several $100s of material. Enough to buy groceries, enough to buy time. Fenwick was raising his gavel. Audrey's hand went up. The gallery went quiet in that particular way of people watching someone do something they expect to regret. A man 2 rows ahead of her, well-dressed, grey at the temples, wearing the kind of coat that announced money without announcing it, turned around and looked at her. His expression was pleasant and entirely without warmth. "Are you certain, ma'am?" he said quietly, not cruel, just certain she wasn't. "I am," Audrey said. "Going once," Fenwick said, "going twice." He looked at the room, no movement. "Sold to the woman in the back for $190. Audrey walked to the clerk's table. She handed over her grocery money. She signed a stack of legal forms she didn't fully understand. She walked out of the courthouse and back to her car, a 2008 Honda Civic with a rusted wheel well and winter tires she kept on through September, and she sat with her hands on the steering wheel and allowed herself, very quietly, to cry. Then she wiped her face, popped the trunk, confirmed the crowbar and work flashlight she kept back there since Paul had always insisted on it, and drove to the cannery. Highway 17 along the north shore of Lake of the Woods was beautiful in a cold, indifferent way. The hardwoods had turned and most of the leaves had fallen, and the lake was grey and enormous under a heavy October sky. The Blackwater Cannery appeared at a curve in the road, a large corrugated steel building with a collapsed loading dock, its old painted sign still partially legible in faded red. Blackwater Quality Cannery, East, 1968. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown with dead grass pushing through the asphalt. Audrey worked through the late afternoon with her flashlight and crowbar, methodical and increasingly discouraged. The scrappers had done thorough work years before her. Every accessible copper pipe had been yanked from the walls. The processing floor, enormous, the machinery long gone, held only rust and broken concrete, and the ghost of fish smell, faint but permanent. By 6 o'clock, her salvage pile amounted to perhaps $14 worth of miscellaneous metal fittings. She sat on an overturned plastic crate to rest her back. Outside, the weather had changed. The lake produced its own weather patterns, and they could turn fast. She'd known that her whole life. And the wind coming through the blown-out high windows now had real weight behind it. She checked her phone, a weather service alert. Severe rain and wind warning for the district. Highway 17 closures possible. Her tires were bald on the driver's side. She was not going to drive that highway in this. She found shelter in the manager's office at the rear of the building. A small room with a heavy metal door that had, by some accident of construction, kept out the worst of the weather and the worst of the vandals. There was a metal desk, 2 filing cabinets bolted to the wall, and a framed photograph, the kind of formal company photo from another era, of Regis Harmon shaking hands with someone in a hard hat at the cannery's opening ceremony. Harmon was grinning, broad, confident, entirely at ease. The grin of a man who believed absolutely in his own permanence. Audrey dragged the desk chair into the corner, pulled her coat tight, and turned off her flashlight to save the battery. The storm pushed against the walls of the building. She closed her eyes. She did not know how long she had been asleep when the sound pulled her back. It was mechanical, a low rhythmic grinding, then a metallic clunk, then silence, then it repeated. It was coming from behind the filing cabinets on the far wall. She clicked her flashlight on and sat perfectly still. The sound came again, deliberate like clockwork. Not a rat, not the building settling. She stood. She crossed the room and pushed experimentally at the rightmost filing cabinet. It moved, not the heavy anchored resistance she'd expected, but a smooth, easy roll. It was mounted on heavy-duty institutional casters, she realized, the kind that locked in place but released easily. Both cabinets were. They had been designed to move. Behind them, the concrete wall had a faint, rectangular seam. Barely visible, the line of it only apparent because the surrounding concrete had been painted over many times while the rectangle hadn't. In the center of the rectangle was a circular recess, roughly the diameter of a $2 coin, machined smooth. On the floor, half hidden under the edge of the cabinet she'd rolled aside, was a brass fitting. Hexagonal, heavy, the size of an old industrial valve cap. She picked it up and rubbed the grime off it with her thumb. She aligned it with the recess. She pushed it in and turned it clockwise. From deep within the wall, something large and hydraulic engaged. A pressurized exhalation, the clunk of a multi-point lock releasing, and then the concrete panel, which was not concrete at all, but a thick steel door faced with a poured concrete veneer, swung inward on heavy hinges that had been lubricated far more recently than the rest of the building suggested. A short concrete corridor, cold still, perfectly sealed, no smell of mold. Whoever had built this had built it to last. At the end of the corridor was an industrial cold storage door, the kind designed to hold temperature in a processing facility. The wheel handle had already been turned to the open position. Not all the way, just ajar. Audrey pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was the size of a large walk-in closet. On the left wall, a row of sealed metal transport cases, the kind used for scientific samples, each one latched and labeled with handwritten dates. Along the back, a stainless steel prep table on locking casters, positioned near the wall. On the table, 4 government green binders, sealed with evidence tape. The old kind, the kind that cracked and dried at the edges after decades. And in the center of the table, wrapped in waxed cloth and tied with cotton cord, something that made Audrey set down her crowbar. She unwrapped it carefully. It was a basket, birch bark, tightly stitched at the base, decorated across the body with a pattern of dyed porcupine quillwork in reds and blacks, and a particular shade of faded gold. Even in the beam of a work flashlight in a sealed concrete room, it was extraordinary. Audrey had spent 30 years as a school librarian and had catalogued dozens of books on Anishinaabe cultural history. She knew what she was looking at. She had seen photographs of this specific piece, or what she was almost certain was this specific piece, in an academic monograph she had processed in 1998. It had been reported stolen from a private estate in Dryden in 1987. It had never been recovered. She set the basket down with great care. She opened the first green binder. The entries were not production records. They were internal quality control reports, dated August through October 1991. Every single report flagged critical botulism contamination, Clostridium botulinum, isolated in batch series 7 through 12, confirmed at the company's own laboratory. Each report bore the signature of the facility manager, and on the summary pages, the counter-signature of Regis Harmon himself. He had known. Helen Crow and Albert Fiedler had died. 7 families had spent weeks in hospital. The provincial investigation had found contamination records, but concluded the timeline of Harmon's knowledge was unclear. It had not been unclear. It had been sealed in a reinforced concrete room on the shores of Lake of the Woods for 33 years. Audrey's hands were not steady. She reached into her pocket for her phone. No signal. 3 inches of reinforced steel and concrete in every direction. She needed to get out of this room. She needed to get to the highway. She heard the footstep. 1. From the corridor. She turned. Conrad Ashworth stepped through the cold storage doorway. He had changed from his auction day coat into a waxed canvas jacket and rubber boots. In his right hand was a long hunting knife. In his left, a heavy flashlight that he raised to sweep slowly across the room. The sample cases, the binders, the basket. Something shifted in his expression when the light hit the basket, a barely contained hunger. "You found the fitting," he said. "It was on the floor," Audrey said. 4 years. Conrad said it almost to himself. He took a step into the room. "I have been through that office 4 years. Every time the county's inspection rotation gave me a gap in coverage." His eyes moved to the green binders. "Regis told me everything before he died. He told me about the room, the mechanism, the valve fitting he had custom machined. He said he'd hidden it in the office. I assumed he meant something deliberate, something concealed." A pause. "Not simply dropped and kicked under a cabinet in 2019. "You let me outbid you," Audrey said, "at the auction today." Any purchase by a party connected to the Harmon name would have triggered a provincial heritage review. Conrad moved slightly to the side, positioning himself between Audrey and the corridor. But a grieving widow buying a contaminated property for scrap? Nobody looks twice. He glanced at the basket. "I didn't know about that. Regis never mentioned it. I'll figure out what it's worth." He moved the knife to a deliberate grip. "Step away from the table." Audrey looked at him. She looked at the knife. She looked at the green binders under her right hand, and thought about Helen Crow and Albert Fiddler, and the 7 families who had never received a single true answer about what had happened to them in the autumn of 1991. She thought of Paul. Paul, who had spent 3 years fighting his own body and never gone quiet. Paul, who had sat beside her on a Saturday afternoon in the spare room, laughing at her inability to move a heavy appliance, and said, "Audrey, everything that's heavy and needs to move has a release. You just have to find it. Once you know it's there, it's obvious." She looked at the prep table. She looked at the caster locks, 4 of them, the old lever style, pressed down to the locked position. She took 1 step back from the table. She pressed the toe of her boot against the nearest caster lock and pushed down. It released with a quiet click. She got the second one. "I said," Conrad repeated louder, moving forward. She got the third. She planted her weight against the near end of the table and threw herself into it with everything she had. 200 kilograms of stainless steel on freshly unlocked casters, on a sealed concrete floor with no friction, moved like a freight train. The far edge caught Conrad across both shins, with a sound like a bat striking a fence post. The flashlight went one direction. The knife clattered under the sample cases. Conrad went down sideways onto the concrete, and the air left him in one violent, wrenching gasp. Audrey grabbed the 4 green binders. She tucked the wrapped basket under her arm. She ran. She hit the corridor at full speed, pulled the steel door shut behind her, drove the hex fitting back into the valve, and felt the hydraulic locks engage with a definitive clunk she felt in her back teeth. The pounding started within seconds. Muffled, useless, 33 years too late. She stood in the dark manager's office and listened to it for exactly as long as it took her to find her flashlight. Then she walked through the Cannery, got into her car, and drove. 15 kilometers down the highway, her phone showed 2 bars. She pulled over onto the gravel shoulder and called 911. She told them everything, clearly and in the correct order, the way a librarian tells a story. Sergeant Kelly Marsh of the Kenora RCMP detachment arrived at the Cannery at 4:40 in the morning with 2 OPP constables and a forensic technician. Conrad Ashworth was removed from the sealed cold storage room at 5:22 a.m., cold, furious, and unable to stand without assistance. He was charged that afternoon with forcible confinement and uttering threats. Additional charges, Sergeant Marsh told Audrey, were pending as the investigation widened. Audrey sat in the back of an OPP SUV wrapped in a thermal blanket, both hands around a paper cup of Tim Hortons someone had driven in from town. By mid-morning, the forensic team had opened the metal sample cases. The preserved contamination cultures from batch series 7 through 12 were intact, chain of custody labels still legible after 3 decades in a climate-controlled room. Combined with the green binders, they constituted, in the careful language of the provincial investigator who arrived from Thunder Bay, a complete evidentiary record. The 1991 case was formally reopened before noon. Families in Sioux Narrows, who had spent 33 years without an explanation, would finally have one. A representative from the Anishinaabe nation of the Lake of the Woods arrived that afternoon with a cultural repatriation specialist named James Okafor from the Ontario Heritage Trust. James stood beside the evidence table where the basket had been placed and was quiet for a long time. "It belonged to the Kakagamic family in Dryden," he said finally. "It was taken in 1987. We have been looking for it for 37 years. He looked at Audrey. "You kept it safe." Audrey didn't have a response for that. She just nodded, because her throat had closed unexpectedly. A few hours after that, a woman from the Heritage Trust's Cultural Property Division sat across from Audrey in a parked car and explained, in steady and careful language, that under the Ontario Heritage Act and the Federal Cultural Property Export and Import Act, Audrey was entitled to a voluntary recognition payment for the lawful recovery and preservation of a protected cultural artifact of significant historical and cultural value. The payment would be processed through a joint provincial and federal fund. "How much?" Audrey asked. $1.4 million, Canadian, the woman said. "It is not subject to income tax under the cultural property provisions." Audrey set her coffee cup down on the center console. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked out at the grey lake through the windshield. The arc lights of the scene, the police tape, the pale October sky beginning to lighten above the tree line on the far shore. And she felt, for the first time in 8 months, something that was not grief, and was not fear, and was not the low, grinding hum of a debt she couldn't pay. "Okay," she said. 3 weeks later, Audrey Carmichael stood on the front step of the house on 3rd Street in Kenora. The bank's notice was gone from the door. The mortgage was paid in full. Every hospital invoice, every equipment rental charge, every bill that had accumulated in the spare room alongside Paul's rented bed was cleared. On the porch railing in the terracotta pot Paul had planted the spring before everything changed was the climbing rose he had always been certain would survive. It was October. It was northwestern Ontario. Every sensible person she knew had told her the thing was finished. There was one small red bud beginning to open at the end of a cane she hadn't noticed before. Audrey rested her hand on the railing and looked at it for a long time. "You were right," she said quietly. "The quiet ones do hold the deepest secrets." She had walked into that cannery with $82 and a crowbar, and she had walked out with the truth. And sometimes it turns out the truth is worth more than anyone who tried to bury it could have imagined. What would you have done in that sealed room, in the dark, with a knife between you and everything you were trying to protect? Leave a comment below. I genuinely want to know. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things. Subscribe to Claim the Drama for more stories about real moments, impossible choices, and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself until it has absolutely no other option.